This conference will now be recorded.
Good morning. My name is Greg Wadley. Well, actually, good afternoon. My name is Greg, and I'm the Clear Roads Administrator. We're here for the final webinar for the project entitled Aftermarket Cameras in Winter Maintenance Vehicles. The research team from SRF is led by Mark Gallagher. Before I turn it over to Mark, I want to let everybody know that this webinar is being recorded and it'll be posted on the Clear Roads website at a later date for viewing at your convenience. We also ask that everybody stays on mute so that there's no background noise. However, if you have any questions or comments, please enter them into the chat box and we'll address them at the end of the presentation. I think that's all for housekeeping items. So I'm going to turn over to our research team, and it's all yours, Mark.
Hi, everybody. My name, as Greg mentioned, is Mark Gallagher. I'm with SRF Consulting Group, and I am the once and future project manager for this project. It's been a little bit of a long road getting here. I started out as a PM, and you'll notice the project number is 1703. So we began this a while ago, and unfortunately, I had a little bit of medical leave that I had to take there, and we handed it off to a new PM who carried it forward through the majority of the project, but then we wish him well, but he has taken another position, has gone to work in the transit world, so it's come back to me. But I am glad to be back and glad to be wrapping up the project and want to share with you some of the interesting things we learned during the synthesis. Kicking off, we do want to make some acknowledgments for all the folks that helped us move along through the project. Of course, to Greg at CTC, who always does a fantastic job of keeping everything on the rails and organizing everybody and bringing us all together so we can talk about what we learned. Tom, Joe, Jeff, Daniel, and Brian, our project TAC, who again provided a lot of guidance in terms of where we wanted to go and had the enviable job of reviewing all the deliverables that we submitted along the way. A few folks that we also want to give a quick mention to are some of the vendors that we talked to, and as we go through the presentation, we'll talk a little bit about some of the folks that we talked to out in the world of making vehicle cameras and some of the stuff we learned from them. And just as a note, the consultant team, again, I'm Mark Gallagher, the project manager. Chris Curd was project manager for a little while on this, and again, he's moved on. We wish him well. And also joining us on the call today is Eric Mingy from SRF. And so unless folks have things that we need to address before we dive into it, we'll do a little bit of talking about the project goal and background, and then get into the process and ultimately some of the things that we learned. So you can read it there. The goal here was to document the value of these camera systems, find the issues that are encountered with installation or use, and ultimately make some recommendations about how these can be installed, how they can be used, and maybe in some cases even how they shouldn't be installed or used. Quick word of background about using cameras on aftermarket cameras on winter maintenance vehicles. Winter maintenance vehicles largely being snow plows and tow plows for the purposes of the study. These are becoming increasingly common. We saw a few years ago the notion of what's commonly called a plow cam begin to emerge, which is really a forward-facing dash cam that captures images of the roadway. In a lot of cases, these are made available to the public as a traveler information service, so they can get more than just a general description, but can actually see road conditions out there during winter storms. And what we're seeing now is live video is being used more commonly by vehicle operators and in some cases even supervisors to monitor vehicle systems as winter maintenance operations are taking place. This project had a few simple tasks just for everybody's context. We performed a literature review. We surveyed the industry, which included largely winter maintenance agencies that do these sorts of things to manage storms, stuff like that. We also performed follow-up interviews with a few of the folks out there at the agency level that we surveyed and provided interesting responses where we wanted to know more and thought it would be useful for the group to include that. We spoke to 2 different vendors, and we'll talk about why we chose the 2 that we did when we get to that part of the presentation. There was also a pilot deployment, and that ended up being an interesting story. So as we get to that, I'll let everybody know what the background and sort of how that came to be initially and what we ended up doing with that task. Then finally, a set of recommendations. And I think we learned some really interesting, really useful stuff. But for those who aren't going to be able to stay with us for the whole call, we did want to include a slide right up front that kind of is the set of spoilers for what we're going to be talking about in more detail later on. The key takeaways that we found is that cameras on vehicles are common. Of the agencies that we talked to, about 2/3 of them used 1 or more cameras on a vehicle. But we also found that there isn't a lot of communication between agencies about how they select these, what's important to them, how they use them, and what some of the issues that they have are. Driver monitoring of the vehicle systems. In a lot of cases, the material spreaders on the back so that you can see if it's throwing down salt is really kind of the most common use, with some other vehicle systems like tow plows, wing plows, belly plows also being monitored. As you can expect, the durability and the camera quality were the really important questions that folks had when they were looking at these systems. In most cases, more important than actual system cost. They really wanted things that provided a good image and that were going to last. Maintenance costs on systems are pretty low. Per vehicle, what we got for reported costs were between $50 and $200 per year. I have a feeling that we weren't able to capture the fact that in some cases there simply is no maintenance on a year-to-year basis. But in any case, what we're seeing is costs are generally low. The most common issue, far and away, is image degradation due to dirt and moisture. And what this means is that the camera housing or lens is getting dirty. As you can imagine, facing out the back of a vehicle, you pick up a lot of that spray in your wake. It all ends up accumulating on the back of the vehicle. That includes the camera. And we'll talk a little bit about how you deal with that as we get farther into the presentation. The most common installation issues really have to do with the connectors used and the cabling. Some of the cameras that folks have used have what you might describe as office or indoor grade connectors on them. And making sure you have locking connectors and that you properly seal any connections is really important to making sure that the system is reliable. We don't see a lot of people recording video. You get the still frames from plow cams, but not a lot of video being recorded. And in even fewer cases is anybody transmitting video. In some cases, the camera itself can record video. In other cases, you might have a video recorder on the vehicle as a separate device. But very rarely do you see anybody trying to transmit video live from the vehicle and record that elsewhere. And that's largely due to the quality of video you can get over a cellular or other wireless data network. There are initially a lot of driver privacy concerns. It wasn't uncommon to hear about initial resistance to deployment of camera systems on vehicles, but over time, what we've heard is that drivers really find these things to be really valuable. And the resistance to having them tends to evaluate once they get a season under their belts of actually seeing what these can do for them in terms of monitoring vehicle systems. Another interesting lesson we picked up from one of the folks that we talked to in an interview is, to the best of your ability, keep your systems open so that if you need to change either the cameras or the back-end video management system that you're using to extract still images or record video or otherwise manage these things, make those as open as possible, because people have run into issues with changing course on these over time and ended up being locked into single systems. So those are the spoilers of the project. And up next, I'd like to talk a little bit about what we did for the literature review. Does anybody have any questions or anything that we want to deal with right away for anyone who might have to jump off the call? All right. Seeing nothing in the chat box and hearing nothing from the folks online, let's talk a little bit about the literature review that we did. There isn't a lot of literature out there about this. We found about 18 sources of information, mostly online. A lot of things were case studies, some interesting bits of product literature, stuff like that. But we did try to cast as wide a net as possible in terms of looking at mobile video systems. So we included things like transit, first responders, fire and police vehicles, emergency management, law enforcement, and even commercial trucking, because they, for reasons that differ a bit from the winter maintenance folks, commercial trucking has their own reasons for wanting to record what's going on there with video. Camera applications were extremely common, is what we found, but there are a lot of different configurations that people use. Some of the things that we found, particularly for configurations, the notion of the plow cam or dash cam that faces forward is meant to capture road conditions. That is far and away the most common application out there. But again, as I mentioned, there are others that view things like the spreader, wing plow, belly plow, any of the other items on the vehicle that a driver could have trouble seeing just in terms of the line of sight. People have used cameras to see those and present what could be called a split screen or a tiled view in the vehicle, so that live you can look at multiple things happening as you go down the road and are either plowing or applying material. In general, almost all attempts at live transmission, be they from buses, emergency vehicles, things like that, have had fairly poor results. And that's largely down to the network that you're moving video on. In some very dense urban areas, particularly the ones that have denser 5G with the shorter 6 gig millimeter wave stuff, or the very dense urban cells, they work better. But that isn't really where you typically do the winter maintenance that we're considering here. And so as you move out of these urban areas, you get older generation cellular equipment and you get much longer distances between cells, and that equals lower throughput. And so there hasn't been a lot of work done with live transmission in terms of, I guess, ongoing systems. A lot of people have tried it, but you don't see a lot of large deployments that way. And again, as I mentioned before, we found that recording and review of live video is pretty uncommon, other than still images captured from plow cams. We also found some pretty prominent deployments that we ended up taking a little bit closer look at later on, and we'll talk about some of that in just a minute here. The Minnesota DOT has cameras on about 25% of its plows. I think it's more than that now. And that's integrated with the 511 traveler information system to display those plow cam images. Iowa DOT, again, cameras. It says on most, I've worked with the folks in Iowa a little bit. I wouldn't be surprised if it's just all of the cameras now, also integrated with their 511 system. They actually took a really interesting path to getting there. They initially had created an application that ran on iPhones, which I thought was a really novel approach to doing this, because it put your camera, computing device, and communications all in one very nice little box that they could put a mount in the vehicle on and face out the front window. But as we mentioned before, as one of the spoilers, that ended up creating problems over the long term for maintainability and software compatibility. And so I worked with them a couple of years ago to find a more generalized, more open solution that they could work with using a dedicated camera system. Michigan DOT has a pilot deployment out there. They're also integrated with 511. And the Delaware DOT also does, and we looked at them because they do 4 cameras per plow. So they're getting really comprehensive looks at what's going on. And I don't know if at this point, if they have it integrated with 511, but when we initially did the literature review, they did not. And here's a quick view of what we found for manufacturers out there. People who will happily sell you a camera that you can bolt onto a vehicle. There are a lot. That said, I will throw out the proviso that some of these are repackaging other manufacturers' cameras. For example, Delcan, I don't think is actually manufacturing their own camera. I believe they're kind of white labeling somebody else's equipment, but I didn't have one in hand to sort of take it apart and see what was going on. Whereas the folks like Axis, Bosch, Dakota Micro, Logitech, they are primary manufacturers of video camera systems. We also included a couple of what are called NVR, network video recorder, or hybrid VR, hybrid video recorder providers. Those folks make boxes that have solid state, or in some cases even spinning hard drives that you can bolt into vehicles and run on a vehicle-based network. So you have a little switch that connects to the camera, to your communications device, and also to one of these video recorders. All of the video recorders will allow you to remotely access video on them, but as we mentioned before, the performance over a wireless network for that tends to be pretty poor, and so usually the application for recorded video is review of incidents and things like that. So that is the quick overview of the literature review. Of course, in the final report, there is a lot more detail about what we did and where we looked. Are there any questions or anything that we want to talk about now before we move on and talk about our survey? And seeing nothing in the chat box and hearing nothing from the group, we'll talk about the survey and sort of who we heard from, what we asked, and a few of the interesting responses. I'm not going to go through all of them. We had a fairly extensive survey and did some interesting crosstabs on our results. I'll touch on some of the high points here, but if you take a look at the final report, there's a lot more detail there, and there's also a technical memorandum that has a lot of the results and crosstab analysis there. So for folks who are really interested, please take a look at those documents. In our survey, I'll probably misspeak. I want to say we sent out 42 invitations to participate. We got 29 responses covering 25 different states. And you can see in our nice map there, the states that responded. It's who you would expect, the folks that end up dealing with snow a lot. A couple of the highlights for what we found. You can see there what people are looking at with these cameras. Far and away, a rear view camera and a spreader camera are the most common. And some of the other systems that I talked about, underbody plows, pre-wet systems, brine sprayers, things like that. We also had a few folks that answered none. I'm not quite sure what that means in this case. There are some interesting responses also when we asked about the monitor for the driver. In some cases, there are monitors that are only active in reverse, which is interesting. It obviously limits what you can do going down the road, but it's meant to be a safety implication whenever your truck is backing up. Instead of relying on the big elephant ear mirrors, you actually have a camera back there. And some of them really talked about the need to dim the monitor. And we'll talk about that again when we get into some of the recommendations. Typical costs. They were really all over the place. Some folks said that it was less than $500 per vehicle to outfit them, all the way up to $2,000 to $4,000 range. This I thought was really interesting, ranking the criteria when selecting the camera system. You can see in the large blocks there, durability was far and away the number one answer that people provided. And it was really big for sort of the number two ranking as well. For some of the other stuff, as I mentioned at the beginning, image quality. Oh, I'm sorry. I just saw something pop up in the chat box there. We'll come back to address that in a bit. Image quality, also really big. Interestingly enough, some folks ranked as third the camera size, like the physical size of the camera as it mounts on the vehicle was really important to them. But you can see very quickly what breaks out as being important, and really the durability of the system is what registers with people. And we talked about this a little bit before as well. What do people use these for? The biggest answers are monitoring still images, in a few cases even monitoring live video, but the big ones are driver monitoring of the system and sending images to the traveler information sites, the whole PlowCam application. So to wrap up what we heard in our survey, 2/3 of them use cameras, but again, what other agencies may be doing with them turned out to be limited. It was one of the questions we addressed. Again, can take a look at the final report of the technical memo that goes into each question in detail. There's camera washing systems where reported is used by 7 of the respondents, and those ended up being really important, as we'll talk about later on. The rear view spreader wing plow cameras are the ones that really have the cleaning issues, which makes perfect sense. The dash cams or plow cams are generally interior to the vehicle. We did some crosstabs on them, and again, take a look at the report because there are some interesting things there. We did see system cost by manufacturer being sort of all over the place. There doesn't seem to be a price point that is going to be universally applicable when somebody says, I want to have cameras on my vehicle. What do they cost? It really depends on what you're buying and from whom. And what I also found interesting is that when people reported technical issues, either failures or installation problems, things like that, there really wasn't any correlation to cost that we could come up with. And admittedly, we have a small sample size, but if there were a strong correlation, you'd expect that to start to emerge. So more expensive does not necessarily mean better in terms of reliability or installation. As you just saw, things like video quality, durability, the ability to clean lens are really important criteria. All things related to kind of system life and video image quality. And again, very few users were doing much to archive video out there. This survey led us down some interesting paths in terms of wanting to know more about what some of the individual respondents were doing. So of those, we had within our scope the ability to talk to up to 3 additional agencies out there and engage with them directly, go to them with a series of topics that we had talked through with the TAC and get a little bit clearer view of what's going on. So for the follow-up interviews, we tried to find some criteria that made sense. Of the folks who responded, how do we figure out who's interesting that we want to talk to more? Well, one of the things that we thought was interesting was deployment size. People who have a lot of vehicles equipped with cameras, largely because we thought that the larger sample size in terms of vehicles might be more revealing for issues that begin to arise. We looked at what people reported for camera manufacturer, who made it, and what it cost. Were there any interesting outliers on there that brought them up to sort of the surface of interest for doing an in-depth interview? Where they were using the cameras on the vehicles, just plow cams versus some of these multi-camera systems. Whether or not they reported any issues with their systems, we would want to know a little bit more about that. What did they see? Where did they see it? How did they resolve it? Stuff like that. And then lastly, were there anything that were really novel in terms of applications, things that we hadn't really seen commonly used and might be of interest to the larger winter maintenance community? So the first folks we talked to were the Minnesota DOT, largely because they had a big fleet at the time, began equipping them in 2011 and had over 200 plows with cameras. I believe it's actually quite a bit more than that now. They have a standard plow cam, a dash-mounted camera that faces forward, plus additional cameras being added to vehicles. They have a spreader and a rear view camera as well. For the vehicles that have tow plows, which are not incredibly common, but I'm seeing more and more of, we have 20 of them in Minnesota. There is a dedicated camera specifically to watch the position of the tow plow behind the vehicle. The vendor that they use is ProTech Design. ProTech relies on axis cameras, and as we noted before, the cameras have a heated lens housing on them, and that ends up being really important to try and keep the system clear and get good visibility as you proceed down the roadway. MnDOT also indicated that camera durability was very important to them. And I think that's going to be universally true for any folks who have to do fleet maintenance. You don't want to be digging into vehicles a lot, particularly for a secondary system like video monitoring. And just as an overall impression, they really like their cameras. They're considered to be a valuable asset, not only by the drivers who like them to be able to monitor things for operations and safety, supervisors like them, the general public really likes having access to those plow cam images, things like that. So overall, in a large system like MnDOT's, the reaction is pretty positive. As long as you maintain a really robust, physically reliable camera system, there's a lot of positive feeling about those. We also talked to the South Dakota DOT. You can see an interesting little picture of a camera cleaning system over on the side there. They use several cameras on the vehicles. They've got forward-facing ones, the plow cams. They've got their backup cameras. They also monitor wing plows and tow plows with cameras monitored out on the passenger side mirror. And they monitor the spreader. So they have a really extensive system. What is sort of interesting about theirs is the in-cab display of all of the video streams is through the same interface as their MDSS. And in this case, the MDSS is provided by Delcan, who also provides their AVL system, who also provides the MDC. So they have a really interested integrated system as well that brings all of these things together into a single user interface for the driver. And they also noted how important it was to be able to wash the system. And they have both fluid washers and air spray on theirs. So South Dakota has a really interesting, very robust system as well. And if I'm remembering correctly, they're also the folks that highlighted the importance of making sure that your cabling is kind of properly protected on the vehicle and watching those connectors to make sure that they're locked in and that they do a good job of keeping contamination out. They said that installation actually went really smoothly. They haven't had any that have needed to be replaced, and the cleaning system really works, and they really recommend it. On the other hand, they do some compression, on the video as it's traveling down the road. And when you're traveling down the roadway and the camera's moving, you're getting a lot of pixel movement from frame to frame. They did see image quality degrade. So as you're examining these, it's a good idea to see if you can do a demo with the vehicle in motion and make sure that the video quality remains acceptable. And as I mentioned, they had some issues with cable connections working loose. And making sure that you have locking ceiling connectors is a really good idea. But overall, they were able to resolve all of these issues, and they're really looking forward to deploying on their new vehicles as new vehicles come into service. Our last interview was with the city of Farmington Hills, Michigan, and their plow system, their existing maintenance vehicle deployment in itself was not anything that stood out as unusual, but we did find out some other interesting things from them. As you can see, they've got somewhere around 14 or 15 plows. I'm guessing it's slightly more than that now with cameras. They do multi-camera systems. It's provided by MS Foster, who is a common equipment supplier for dump truck winter maintenance type things. The only issue that they really reported, and one of the reasons we flagged them, is in the survey they said, oh yes, we have had an issue, but the only issue was really a washer fluid leak on one of the cleaning systems for the camera. They also say that the cleaning system is very effective. It is highly recommended. And as with other survey respondents, we found that engaging drivers will overcome any resistance that you have to the initial deployment, allowing them to participate in the design of the system. They found to be very helpful, and then a season of experience with it really went a long way towards gaining acceptance within the operator community. And their plan is eventually to install these on the full fleet. A footnote that I'll throw in before we move on, and we'll come back to this a little bit when we talk about the pilot deployment, is Farmington Hills initially also told us that they had done a demo of a multi-camera system that was live streaming. In this case, it was on an excavator that they're using for construction, but we're interested in going further with that and seeing if that would work on maintenance vehicles as they travel down the road. We were really interested in looking at that for the pilot deployment, but that didn't play out the way that we had thought. And so we'll come to that story in a little bit, but keep City of Farmington Hills, Michigan in the back of your head as we move on a little bit. Up next, we'll talk about the vendors that we spoke to as part of our interviews. We talked to two. First one was Bosch. And we talked to Bosch largely because that's who Farmington Hills said that they were looking at using a live stream video solution from. So we thought it would be a great idea to understand a little bit more about what they do and what sort of products they offer. What they recommend for vehicle applications is the Mix 7000 series. You can see a picture of one there. The Mix 7000s are interesting because they are pan-tilt zoom cameras as opposed to the fixed cameras that you see in a lot of vehicle deployments. Not only is it a PTZ system, it has an integrated defogger and defroster system, so that's that heated lens cover on there. And it has a tiny little windshield wiper on it. So these cameras are pretty robust in environments with high contamination. These are commonly used for roadway monitoring, security, traffic surveillance, CCTV, those sorts of things. One of Bosch's biggest claims to fame is they've got processing on the camera. They do what they call intelligent video analytics, which enables things like object detection, object tracking, all sorts of interesting interactive features with the camera where it's processing the video live and can take action depending upon what it detects. They also bill it as having really good low light performance, and you can even get an optional infrared illuminator. And On top of all that, it has image stabilization, which addresses some of the items that we talked about, particularly with South Dakota DOT, where you get that camera with a lot of pixel jiggle from frame to frame, causing all sorts of issues with your compression and transmission as you view it. We thought all that sounded really interesting, so we wanted to talk to them a little bit more about what they do for vehicle applications. And as I mentioned, we contacted them based on the city of Farmington Hills. They had 4 cameras on an excavator. And this is why it's a great idea to do these interviews and engage with folks directly. Because Bosch, when we got a hold of them at the corporate level, said basically we'd never heard of that. They weren't familiar with that, and frankly, they don't recommend these cameras for snowplow applications. Their thought was that an independent distributor or equipment reseller out there had cobbled together the system by themselves, but it wasn't something that they recommended, and it wasn't something that they were ready to engage with, which affected our pilot deployment plans. So the camera itself is nice. It's environmentally hardened. There are all sorts of video management and playback systems available with Bosch's software. You can do all sorts of really neat things with the cameras. But when we talked to Bosch Corporate's engineering staff, video transmission issues plagued every attempt they had ever done to try and move video live from vehicles. They, as a matter of fact, said at this point they were unwilling to engage in trying to do projects like that, largely because they had not been able to overcome the technical limitations. And although we've got these nice defroster and image stabilization functions, they're not optimized for moving vehicles, particularly snowplows. So although you have that nice defroster and heated cover on it, it isn't built to withstand the sort of volume of material that you'd get in the spray behind a vehicle. So while we were disappointed that we couldn't work with Bosch to maybe demonstrate some of their equipment, talking to them directly about this was extremely helpful, because it highlighted not only some of the limitations for their style of equipment, it also points you in the direction of what is desirable and what is going to work out there. We also talked to Ameritrac, largely because they were MnDOT's supplier, and they are big. I'm sure most of the folks out there have either used or heard of Ameritrac equipment. We thought a large fleet deployment would be something interesting to look at, and we could learn a lot from them. They supply an in-cab display for the system for the drivers, and they manage images coming off of the plow cam going out to the 511 system. They primarily provide turnkey solutions for fleet vehicles. And so along with these AVL solutions, you can option them with camera systems. Interestingly enough, they use Axis cameras, and they recommend dome cameras with heated lenses on them. So while a dome camera it's a little bulkier than some of the small candy bar style or bullet style ones, it does give you an easy way to clean it, because as you spray it, it'll drain to the bottom away from the lens. And also, one of the interesting things we learned from them is that when we're mounting cameras on vehicles, they recommend putting them at greater than 4 feet above the roadway. And there are 2 reasons for that. Number one, it reduces the likelihood somebody's going to bump their head on it when they're walking around a vehicle, and cameras can be replaced, but heads are harder to come by, so you want to minimize both the damage to the driver and to the system, but also that tends to reduce the salt and sand spray accumulation on the system. So that was a nice kind of bit of insight into how to design these deployments that we got from Ameritrac. The pilot deployment task deserves a little bit of description and background. Initially in the scope, there was just a task called a pilot deployment that was meant to be redefined as we went through the project in conjunction with input from the TAC, the advisory committee, based on what we learned in the earlier stages to see what we could come up with for a deployment that we would learn from, something that other folks hadn't done, something that would be interesting, something that was interesting to this group, and something that we could really kind of document installation procedures and things like that. So that took a really circuitous path. We got through our survey and interview tasks. And as I mentioned, the Farmington Hills experience was really interesting. It sounded as though they had developed a way to get data from multiple cameras off of vehicles, which we thought would be really interesting, really useful. We wanted to know how they did that, how they installed it. So we reached out to Bosch, and as I mentioned, Bosch said, yeah, we wouldn't try that. We're not interested in working with you on it. So we had to come up with a different approach for our pilot deployment if we weren't going to do the live video in motion transmission. What we eventually settled on that would be interesting to the group after talking to the TAC was looking at what it takes to keep a camera clean. And there are integrated camera and camera washer systems out there. You saw a picture of one early on from the South Dakota example, but those tend to be very expensive. They use the washer system itself is expensive, and they tend to use an expensive camera with it. So then the question arose, well, would that work just as well with some of the lower cost cameras that people had used? Because if you remember from our survey results, we weren't seeing a lot of difference in terms of quality, satisfaction, reliability based on camera cost. So could you use a cheaper camera to actually put your own together and have it work just as well and save some money that way? So we decided to go forward with that. We were going to look at the MS Foster camera wash system, which is a purpose-built maintenance vehicle camera cleaning system. And our low-cost camera was the cab cam, which only cost a few $100s. So we went to ultimately District 4 after asking around within MnDOT where would be a good place to do this. We settled on a pair of vehicles in District 4. We selected our camera. We figured out how we were going to do installation, and we ran out of winter. So we had to put the pilot deployment on hold essentially for last summer until we could figure out when we would get whether that would actually allow us to test the effectiveness of the camera wash system. So we waited, and eventually it began to become last fall, and we geared up again. At which point we found out that the district folks had just gone ahead and done this. They went out and got some lower cost cab cams and MS Foster wash systems, mounted them on vehicles, and by that point had a season of experience with them. So while we weren't able to do a lot with the installation process on that, we now did have a full year of experience using purpose-built wash systems with low-cost cameras. And that system was interesting. It has a cab-mounted switch for camera washing. At this point, nobody really has a good automated way to detect lens contamination and clean it. And folks did say that occasionally the in-cab display was too bright, reflected off the windshield, and was a little distracting that way. But overall, the system actually worked really well. And if you take a look at the conclusions in the final report, you end up saving, gosh, I want to say it was about $1,200 to $1,400 per vehicle by doing it this way, by using a low-cost camera system and a really good quality wash system. And because it worked well, the operators also reported really improved situational awareness. Being able to see whether or not you're actually spreading material, being able to see where that wing plow is hitting the ground and how far out it's going, seeing what's happening in terms of scraping down surfaces with belly plows. All of that is great information to operators. They really like having it, and whatever objections they might have to systems like this tend to evaporate very quickly. So all of that gets boiled down then into a set of recommendations. And again, I urge folks to at least flip to the end of the final report where we talk about recommendations and best practices. There's a much lengthier and more detailed list there, but I'm going to try and hit the high points real quickly. Cannot stress enough, keeping your cameras clean is vital to these things being useful. Use a good washing system. Make sure it's heated so that you don't have freeze on there that your washing system can't get off. The in-cab display is extremely useful for the operators, but make sure it is positioned properly so it's avoiding windshield glare, and make sure that you have a brightness control for them. Any display that you pick should be able to display a minimum of 4 cameras simultaneously. Having drivers try to flip between video feeds while they're going down the road is a distraction, and just giving them a continuous display is far preferable. For those who are thinking about doing live video transmission from vehicles, at this point, that's really hard to recommend. Unless you're in a high-density 5G area, or you have tested and know that you have solid 4G performance. If that's available, you can go ahead and experiment with it, see if it'll work. But if the plan is to jump into a large fleet with streaming video, that's really hard to recommend at this point. We did find that using power over Ethernet cameras tends to really simplify wiring and installation. The systems in Iowa use these, and I actually helped a little bit with the design and layout of that. Being able to run a single camera for cable for the both video data and for power really helps, and it makes things a lot simpler. You can use good quality lock-in connectors for your Ethernet cables, and it makes your maintenance guys' lives a lot easier. As I noted in our pilot deployment, we found that commercial wash systems can be used with really low cost, very effective off-the-shelf cameras. And while that means that you are now assembling a system on your own, it isn't really any harder to install than an integrated system. And depending upon where you are with budgeting, you are saving quite a bit of money per vehicle. So for large fleets in particular, that could be a real cost saver. One thing that we'll throw out that we found with District 4, this wasn't really part of our scope, but I did want to mention it. As kind of an adjunct to doing this video monitoring, understanding where your plow blades are as you're driving down the road, they also deployed a laser system that is mounted up on the cab of the vehicle and points down at the roadway ahead of the vehicle to show where the edge of things like the wing plow blade will be. So without having to look away from the roadway, you have a visual reference for the edge of that plow blade, which drivers really liked. That said, this is something that the equipment installer up in District 4 MnDOT came up with themselves. I don't have any real information on durability or serviceability for this at this point. I also don't know anything about the laser that they're using, and I've worked with lasers for a few things over the years, and you do have to be really careful about the class laser you're using, because you can cause eye damage for people pretty easily. So I'm not in a position at this point that I would recommend deploying these, but I do think looking more closely at them as a driver assistance is certainly worthwhile. And so I will throw that out to the group as well, that this is innovative, it's interesting, it has some real advantages, but I would want to know more about it before I started telling people it's something they ought to do. And lastly, and I think this is kind of just good advice all around, involve the equipment operators in the planning process and the installation design for video systems. A lot of folks report initial resistance. I think that by involving the operators, you kind of move some of that to the side to begin with, and you get a more effective system that is more closely attuned to what they need, what they expect. And ultimately, really, that's better return on investment for whatever you're going to spend to deploy these systems out there. So that is the quick presentation here. Eric and I want to say thank you to everybody out in the group, especially the technical committee, but everybody who's on the call here and everybody who answered surveys and participated in this process. And with that, I will give it back to Greg. And we have about a half an hour, so it looks like, for questions if people have any.
All right, thanks, Mark. I appreciate it. Yeah, this would be the time that if you have any questions or comments, you could put them into the chat box, or we could also, depending on how much or little background noise we have, we could actually open up to some questions asked just verbally online. So I think there was the one, Scott Lucas from Ohio had made a comment earlier on, said, I can see an issue with the first question. We only use forward-facing cameras. That was not a selection. This scope, Mark, you want to comment on the scope of this project?
Yeah, it was really intended to look at vehicle monitoring cameras. And so I totally see Scott's point here as well. And that may have been something that we dealt with inelegantly just by omitting it. But yeah, to your point, Greg, the idea was to look at some of these other driver monitoring things. We talk about plow cams because folks reported them a lot, but it was a little bit beyond the scope of what we were trying to work with. In retrospect, seeing Scott's point, we probably should have dealt with that more directly. So point well taken.
Okay. Eric Ming does have a couple questions. So Eric, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention, I think I saw we have the city of Farmington Hills on the line here. So if they have any update from their perspective on the project, maybe any additional lessons learned, maybe to hear from them. And same thing with anyone at MnDOT or others for that matter. I know we collected some of this information a couple of years ago, so some of it is maybe due for an update. So I wanted to prompt people to throw that out there if they have anything.
Okay.
Eric, this is Greg. It was go ahead, Mark. Yep.
I was just going to say Eric was breaking up pretty good there, and so his question was really throwing it out to the MnDOT and other folks that we had talked to. I think Farmington Hills is online, possibly, or the South Dakota folks if they're out there. If you have any updates to what we talked about here, because we did do that survey, almost 2 years ago now, something like that. If you have updates to what we're talking about, either with the numbers or your experience, we'd love to hear about that and have you share it with the group. Very chatty group today.
Yeah, and that's okay. Right. So not hearing or seeing anything else. Well, not seeing anything else on the chat box. So we'll give one more awkward silence if anybody else wants to bring something forward verbally.
Yeah, this is one of the caller numbers. I don't know which one I am. Tom Peters out of Minnesota. I just want to express my appreciation for the flexibility and the fact that, this went on for quite a while. They had targeted a particular district that only made logistically sense because of where they're located, and the district indicated now they were just too busy, they couldn't participate, which frankly personally still irritates me. But that said, then they went ahead and we approached our District 4 up in the northwestern part of our state, and they were more than happy to participate, which is really good. There's a good group up there that they were able to tap into. So appreciate that flexibility there and in getting this done. And yes, I'm going to follow up with your contact up in D4, along with Joe Hunnicky, who you listed as participating, just to see. This is going to be available. I don't know how long that usually takes, but I'll make sure when it's available for the recording and the replay that they see it and go through it. And if they want to offer up anything to this effort, that'd be great. Any idea, Greg, how long it usually takes to get this posted on the website, the link?
My intention would be to try and get this up by the weekend.
Okay, that's perfect. I didn't want to drag things on too long, because I know I'm probably wanting to close it up. And we received confirmation today, by the way, Greg, if you were concerned about this, which impacted your contract with us, and I guess SRS contract too, that they've come to an agreement, and the governor has to sign the transportation bill, which means we won't have to cease existing at the end of this month, and all contracts that we have would have to stop. So we should have something done maybe by the end of today, but we should be in good shape to keep everything going forward. So that is all.
All right, thank you, Tom. I really appreciate that. And yeah, the appreciation towards SRF and their flexibility does not go unnoticed, for sure. Yep. Cliff Spoonmore from Wyoming entered a comment or a question into the chat box, and he asked, did I understand it correctly that we can use Wi-Fi when a truck pulls into a station?
Yeah, and that actually came up in a couple of places of the literature search that we did. Obviously, that's not going to be good for live video going down the road. Where it is useful is if you're using these NVRs, the video recorders on the vehicles. As you approach a Wi-Fi network that you control, you can then connect to it and retrieve video as necessary from the vehicle. Wi-Fi has also been used, if I'm remembering right, in transit and some law enforcement applications to try and move video to vehicles that when they roam into a Wi-Fi hotspot that is enabled. The results of that have not been great. It depends so strongly on the quality of that Wi-Fi connection that unless you have very rigid control over your antenna systems and your hotspots and things like that, it's still hard to do reliable live video. It can be done. We do it at home on our regular computers all the time, right? But once you get outdoors into uncontrolled environments, it gets harder. So the summary I would say is that using Wi-Fi to a vehicle is great for retrieving recorded video for incident analysis or training or things like that, but it's not a great solution for live video.
All right, thank you. Okay, so we did set aside an hour and a half for this, but most of these webinars are taking place a little bit closer to an hour, and we are right now at that 1 hour point. So unless I see anything else come up in the chat box in the next 10-15 seconds, and unless anybody else chimes in that they have a question or comment, I think we're going to go ahead and wrap this up. So just to say again that we will be, reiterate, we are going to be posting this recording on the project page of the Clear Roads website. The final report is currently under review, so for those of you who are on the project subcommittee, please be sure to have any comments that you have on those to me and the research team in the next couple days, as we are trying to wrap this up by the end of the month. And yeah, I think that's it. And I will also, Doug McBroom from Montana said, thanks all, good job. And I'm going to say the same thing. I really appreciate it. Good job on everything that you did, and always continue to do for Clear Roads SRF as a valuable partner in this Clear Roads research effort. So thanks, everybody. Really appreciate your time, and thanks to the SRF.